I'll just look over here, detective.
Yeah.
A serial killer in Texas goes undetected for 11 years.
Yeah,
Police identify a suspect, but their case must be pulled from the trash. Investigators hope new forensic techniques can establish a link among the murders and put an end to the violent rampage. In California, a missing persons case leads detectives to a secret burial ground at a Sacramento boarding house. An unlikely suspect becomes the focus of a mass murder investigation. Can science help unmask the murderer hiding behind a kindly face? Homicide investigators find that things aren't always what they appear to be. Seemingly insignificant clues may expose a pattern and put police on the trail of a killer whose compulsion is to kill again. On the morning of December 21st, 1984, in Wichita Falls, Texas, Lisa Boone returned home from her job at a local hospital and found herself locked out. Lisa asked her landlady to unlock the apartment. She'd given her keys to Terry Sims, a friend and co-worker who was spending the night.
Terry?
But Terry wasn't answering the door.
Terry? Terry?
Inside, the women found the apartment had been ransacked. Lisa called out to Terry, but got no response.
Terry! I didn't hear. Oh, Terry?
The landlady
Terry?
noticed blood on the floor and followed the trail. It led to Terry Sims' body. Officers from the Wichita Falls Police Department responded to the scene. Upstairs, they found the 20-year-old victim dead on the bathroom floor. She was nude except for socks. Her hands had been tied behind her back. Police processed the scene, looking for any clue that might identify the killer. They collected blood samples, a pair of white tennis shoes with the laces still tied, and a woman's hospital uniform. They also recovered a blood-stained bedspread and sheets. At the police station, Lisa told detectives that she and Terry Sims left the hospital together after working the 3 to 11 shift. She explained that she was also a part-time student at Midwestern State University and had an exam the next day. Terry was going to stay the night at Lisa's apartment to help her study in the morning. But Lisa said the hospital was short-staffed that night, so she volunteered for an extra shift. She dropped her friend off at the apartment around 12:30, gave Terry her keys, and returned to work.
When was the last time you saw her?
Lisa told police she'd arrived back home around 7 a.m. and knocked on the door. She had no idea who could have murdered her friend. An autopsy was performed on Terry Sims, and cause of death was determined to be multiple stab wounds to the chest and back. While there was no sign of forcible rape, biological evidence was collected from the victim's body.
Excuse me, detective?
Most murder victims know their killers, so Wichita Falls police began interviewing Terry Sims' family and friends.
About Tony?
You talking about my girlfriend?
They quickly focused on her ex-boyfriend. he denied involvement. Investigators had little evidence against him, but they had a new forensic tool in their arsenal. In 1984, DNA profiling was in its infancy and held the potential to link a killer to his crime through biological evidence left at the scene. But large amounts of evidence were needed to successfully perform the tests. Hoping samples recovered in Terry Sims' case might identify her murderer, police submitted them to the Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. But their hopes were soon dashed. There wasn't enough material for DNA testing. With no hard evidence linking a suspect to the murder, the investigation stalled, and the case remained unsolved. On February 15, 1985, 2 months after Terry Sims was found murdered, an electric company employee was working on a transformer just outside the Wichita Falls city limits. He made a horrifying discovery. He stumbled upon a woman's body. He called 911. Deputies from the Archer County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. In the woods, they found the victim. Nearby, they recovered a leather jacket, a blood-stained nurse's uniform, and a pair of sneakers with the laces still tied. A search of police databases turned up a missing person fitting the victim's description. An autopsy confirmed her identity as Toni Gibbs, a 23-year-old nurse from Wichita Falls, reported missing by her brother a month earlier. The pathologist determined that she died from stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. Biological evidence was collected from the victim's body. Archer County investigators developed several suspects. They soon focused on a man named Danny Wayne Laughlin. He was the last person seen with Toni Gibbs. He had also been held on suspicion of rape in Kansas City, Missouri, less than a year before. Laughlin denied killing Toni Gibbs, but 3 separate polygraph tests suggested deception. At investigators' request, he provided blood and hair samples for DNA testing. Though the results were inconclusive, police believed they had the right man. Laughlin stood trial for the murder of Toni Gibbs. The jury was unable to reach a verdict. A mistrial was declared. Laughlin was never tried again. The Gibbs case remained open. On October 10, 1985, a maintenance worker was cutting grass alongside a road in Wichita County. In the overgrowth, he discovered a woman's body. He called the Wichita County Sheriff's Department. When deputies responded, they found the body of a woman, nude except for one sock. There were no clues as to the victim's identity. Police searched the surrounding area and found her clothing nearby. They also recovered a pair of sneakers with the laces tied. An autopsy was performed, but advanced decomposition made it difficult to determine how the woman died. Based on available evidence, however, the medical examiner concluded the cause of death to be undetermined homicidal violence. Wichita County Sheriff's deputies determined that the victim fit the description of a woman reported missing a month earlier. She was identified as 21-year-old Ellen Blau. They interviewed 2 suspects who had been with her the night she was last seen. But deputies had insufficient evidence to charge them. After several months, the case remained unsolved. While the 3 cases were investigated by different law enforcement agencies, they all fell under the jurisdiction of the Wichita County District Attorney's Office. Barry Maka had recently been elected district attorney and took over just days after Terry Sims' murder. The unsolved murders haunted him.
The absolute terror that they went through in the final minutes of their lives motivated me to find the person responsible for their deaths.
But investigators in each of the cases had exhausted all their leads, and there was nothing more Maka could do. More than a decade would pass before there was a break in the unsolved murders. By 1996, more than 11 years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Texas. Police still had no viable suspects in any of the murders. But improved forensic procedures prompted the Wichita County District Attorney to request a re-examination of the evidence from 2 of the 3 murders. Some of the evidence was sent to Glenn Unash, a latent print examiner at the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab in Austin. He found a partial print on a sneaker recovered from the Terry Sims murder scene that had gone undetected. It didn't belong to Terry Sims. However, there was insufficient detail to make a comprehensive analysis. Because blood will darken as it absorbs the light, Unash hoped more ridge characteristics would emerge under laser light. He was disappointed. There was one more option, a dye staining technique. But there was a risk involved.
The dye staining technique could possibly destroy what is there, so the print was photographed prior to that. Once I got that photograph back, I examined it to make sure I recorded all the characteristics.
Unash was now ready to try the dye staining process. He saturated the print with amino black, which reacts to proteins in blood and turns them dark blue or black. But the process didn't develop any further ridge detail. The evidence enhancement he had hoped for eluded him. Over the next 3 years, he examined a series of suspect prints provided by the Wichita County District Attorney's Office and compared them to the one found on Terry Sims' sneaker.
I did not identify any of the suspects that they had sent me. Reported to them that the print appears to be partial second, third joint or another area of the palm. They started sending me in some palm prints. I made those comparisons, and I still did not identify the print.
At the same time, DNA testing of the biological samples from the Sims and Gibbs cases was again underway at GeneScreen in Dallas. A new technology, PCR analysis, could provide forensic scientist Judy Floyd with more conclusive results than previous tests.
The requirements were not as stringent, and therefore we were able to use this very old, very degraded DNA and obtain a genetic profile of the perpetrator.
The new DNA process eliminated all previous suspects, including Danny Wayne Laughlin, who had stood trial for the murder of Tony Gibbs a decade earlier. But it did turn up a startling piece of evidence. Biological samples recovered from both victims came from the same individual. Emerging technology and improved forensics had linked 2 apparently unrelated cases. Now there was evidence a serial killer had claimed the lives of Terry Sims and Tony Gibbs. District Attorney Barry Maka wondered if some of the other unsolved cases were related. He began taking a closer look at those files. One caught his attention, that of Ellen Blau. Maka noted that circumstances of her murder were similar to the Sims and Gibbs homicides. Down to the sneakers, laces still tied, found by her nude body. On January 12, 1999, Maka asked his investigator, John Little, to review the three cases and try to develop a suspect. He also gave Little a possible lead. Though the victims had been discovered in three different police jurisdictions, they all lived within a relatively small geographical area.
Because of the close proximity, I felt that the person responsible for their deaths had some connection to that neighborhood. And so I emphasized that to John and asked him to review the files and see if he could establish anyone with a connection to the neighborhood that may be involved in the cases.
Little began by probing for common threads among the women. It didn't take him long to find them. He noticed that they all shared several physical characteristics.
All the victims were around the same age, pretty much the same build. They were all around 5 foot tall, not much taller. They all weighed 120 pounds or less. They all seemed to have pretty much the same features.
A distinct pattern was emerging, suggesting all three women had been killed by the same person. Then he found a name in the Ellen Blau file, a man named Farian Wardrip. While in custody on a murder charge back in 1986, Wardrip had told police that he knew Blau. It meant nothing to the police at the time. Little wondered if it meant anything now. He learned Wardrip had worked as an orderly at the same hospital as Tony Gibbs. And records showed that he had left that job 4 days after the first victim, Terry Sims, was found murdered. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more connections between Wardrip and the three women.
John, this is right where.
He had lived in an apartment downstairs from Ellen Blau. That apartment was 2 blocks from the residence where Terry Sims was murdered. When Ellen Blau was murdered, Wardrip no longer lived at her apartment complex. He had moved to a residence across the street from the sub shop where she worked. Authorities had placed Wardrip in the neighborhood and established links between him and the victims. They were a long way from proving murder, but now they felt they were finally on the right track. A background check confirmed that Wardrip was a convicted murderer. He had confessed to killing a Wichita Falls woman in 1986. According to the records, he'd fled to Galveston, but turned himself in to police there. Sentenced to 35 years in prison, Wardrip had been paroled in 1997. During the 11 years he was incarcerated, there were no murders in Wichita Falls that were similar to those of Sims, Gibbs, or Blau.
And I felt like he was a very strong suspect, but the only way to find out for sure if he was the one responsible for these murders or not was to obtain a DNA sample.
Although circumstantial evidence pointed to Wardrip, it wasn't enough to obtain a court order to force him to provide DNA samples. Maka and Little decided to try to collect them surreptitiously. Their plan would require surveillance. Investigators contacted Wardrip's parole officer for information.
So where's he living?
They learned that Wardrip lived in nearby Almy, Texas, where he taught Sunday school and worked at a window screen company. According to the parole officer, Wardrip was being electronically monitored and was restricted to his apartment complex unless he was at work or church.
Appreciate it. Take care.
And that posed problems for investigators. For 3 days, they watched Wardrip at work behind a locked chain-link fence. He seemed to be beyond their reach. But on the 4th day, they got a break. On February 5th, 1999, the fence was unlocked and Wardrip was outside. He was with his wife, eating crackers and drinking coffee from a disposable cup. When he tossed the cup into a trash can just inside the gate, it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The undercover investigator approached Wardrip and asked if he could get a tobacco spit cup. Wardrip told him to help himself. With that, any evidence obtained by investigators would be admissible in a court of law. He retrieved Wardrip's cup. Investigators hoped they now had their DNA sample. But would a few drops of coffee and cracker crumbs be enough to prove murder? More than a dozen years had passed since the murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau in Wichita Falls, Texas. Investigators had finally gathered physical evidence they hoped would prove Farian Wardrip was the killer. Now it was up to Gene Screen Lab in Dallas. Judy Floyd carefully swabbed the lip of the cup to collect Wardrip's saliva. When she compared that to DNA samples retrieved from the Sims and Gibbs murders, she was able to establish a match. And there was more. She discovered that Wardrip's profile was unique. He had not one, but 4 very rare markers in his genetic profile.
His profile was so rare that you would expect it to occur only one time in several thousand times the population of the Earth. And in effect, we were able to say that we have established identity with this particular individual to the evidence involved in Miss Sims and Miss Gibbs' case.
Investigators didn't stop there. At the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, Glenn Unash compared Wardrip's fingerprints to the partial print found on Terry Sims' sneaker. They matched. Besides making a positive identification, Unash could explain much more.
I can also determine how that shoe was held or when that print was left on that shoe. And it was in a direction that the defendant held the shoe or was taking the shoe off the victim's foot, somewhat similar to this, which would be consistent with pulling it off of a victim's foot.
Investigators' patience and ingenuity had paid off. It was time to take Wardrip into custody. They again enlisted the cooperation of his parole officer. On the pretense of a meeting, Wardrip was summoned to the parole office on February 13th, 1999. When he arrived, police arrested Farian Wardrip and charged him with the murder of Terry Sims.
Yeah. All right.
Based on the evidence, police believe Wardrip saw Terry Sims at the door of Lisa Boone's apartment. After forcing his way inside, he tied her hands behind her back, then raped and killed her. Farian Wardrip pled guilty to the capital murders of Terry Sims, Tony Gibbs, and Ellen Blau. He was sentenced to death in the Sims case and received life terms in each of the others. Wardrip also confessed to an additional murder. In all, he had ended the lives of 5 young women. In Texas, a serial killer's guilt was contained in a disposable coffee cup. But on the West Coast, police would have to dig deeper for proof of murder. On November 7, 1988, in Sacramento, California, social worker Judy Moyes contacted Sacramento police about one of her clients, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. She said Bert had disappeared from the boarding house where she'd placed him. His landlady seemed unsure about his whereabouts. Ms. Moyes told police that Dorothea Puente's boarding house was a refuge for indigent people, many with histories of alcohol and drug abuse. It seemed ideal for Bert, a street person with no place to go. He had his own room and TV and was happy there after years of living on the streets. But after a few months, Bert started saying he wanted to leave. Judy Moyes hadn't heard from Bert in 3 months.
Bert, I have your mail.
Mrs. Puente finally explained that Bert had gone to live with his brother in Utah.
I see your medicine. Have you been taking it?
That made no sense to Judy Moyes. She knew Bert Montoya didn't have any family.
Yeah.
She asked police to look into it.
The reason I'm here today,
Officers went to interview Dorothea Puente. She seemed a gracious, grandmotherly woman, charming and eager to cooperate. She said Bert had gone to live with family in Utah. One of the residents in the boarding house corroborated the account.
I know who he is.
All right, well, appreciate your time.
But as the officer was leaving, the resident slipped him a note.
Thank you. Have a good day.
He wanted to talk. He told police that he'd seen some strange things at the house. Bert wasn't the only one who vanished. Another tenant, Ben Fink, had too. And there were others. But their Social Security checks kept coming. He also described a terrible odor around the boarding house. He said he'd once worked at a mortuary and recognized the smell of death.
Whereabouts are these holes?
The police officer filed a missing persons report on Bert Montoya. Detective John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department was assigned the case. The name Dorothea Puente was familiar to him. She was known as a champion of the dispossessed.
She was highly respected for all of her charitable things that she had done to the Hispanic community. There were people that visited from other countries who came here to praise her and talk to her. And she was known in the Hispanic community as doctora, which is Spanish for doctor.
Now, Detective Cabrera requested a background check on Dorothea Puente. Based on her reputation, it wasn't what he expected. He learned that the kindly grandmother was actually only 59 years old and had a criminal history of preying on the elderly. She'd been previously convicted on multiple counts of forging Social Security checks and had served 4 years in prison. For investigators, her MO was surprising.
And she was getting these checks by putting knockout drops in these individuals' drinks. And of course, when they passed out, she took their check and signed it.
Conditions of Dorothea Puente's parole prohibited her from keeping a boarding house. That gave detectives a reason to look deeper into the situation. 4 days after Bert Montoya was reported missing, they met with Judy Moyes, hoping she could provide more information about the boarding house. She said most of the residents were poor, the forgotten elderly who exist on the fringes of society. But Dorothea Puente always had a place for them. And she had a reputation for treating tenants like family. Moyes claimed that several other social workers began to notice that their clients sometimes disappeared from the house, never to be seen again. Bert Montoya was the most recent. Perhaps some of the tenants had simply wandered off, or family members had decided to take care of them. Investigators decided to find out. Later that morning, police met with Dorothea Puente. Although they didn't have a warrant, she graciously gave them permission to conduct a search. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, police found prescription medication, a sedative in the name of Dorothy Miller.
She was related to
Mrs.
the
Puente
tenant.
told them it belonged to a relative who had stayed with her for a while. Investigators asked if they could dig around in her backyard.
About them, but of course the name Dorothy Miller I just told you about.
Mrs. Puente not only gave them permission, she offered to get people in to dig for them.
Didn't even know it was there.
That didn't seem the action of a person with something to hide. Investigators declined her offer and began digging themselves. After finding nothing in 3 holes, they began to think they were wasting their time. But in the 4th, they found corrosive lime, often used to mask odors and speed decay. They decided to keep digging. To their surprise, they uncovered what appeared to be a human leg bone. At a boarding house for the elderly run by 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, Sacramento police uncovered human remains.
We need to get forensics here. Yeah.
The coroner's office and a crime scene unit were dispatched to the scene. Puente agreed to accompany police to the station to make a statement. She was very cooperative and appeared genuinely shocked that bones were found in her yard. She said she had been living there for little more than a year. Perhaps the previous owner could explain the bones. But Puente's criminal past could not be ignored. Police asked her outright if she'd killed her missing tenant, 52-year-old Bert Montoya. Dorothea Puente calmly denied it. Since there was no evidence of any crime, investigators took Mrs. Puente home. The next morning, the search at the boarding house continued. As more police and excavation equipment arrived, curious onlookers and reporters began to assemble outside the house. Around 9:45, Mrs. Puente asked if she was free to go to the corner coffee shop. Since she'd been so cooperative and detectives had no proof of her involvement in any foul play, they let her go. 15 minutes later, at 10 a.m., forensic technicians uncovered a second body, wrapped in a tarp, buried under a cement slab. The condition of the tarp indicated that this body hadn't been underground very long. A police officer was dispatched to pick up Dorothea Puente at the coffee shop. She wasn't there.
We sent people over there to find out who had seen her, if anybody had talked to her, what was going on. They went over there and they had ascertained that she had got into a taxi cab and drove off.
Sacramento police traced the cab and learned it had taken her to the Stockton bus station, 50 miles away. There, they learned she boarded a bus to Los Angeles. Not knowing where she might be heading, investigators launched a nationwide search for Dorothea Puente. She was now wanted on suspicion of murder. At the boarding house, authorities continued digging. Their search for missing person Bert Montoya had unearthed human remains of one victim and a second buried corpse. Mindful of statements that several residents had disappeared, police feared Mrs. Puente's yard might conceal more ugly secrets. The second body had been discovered under a cement slab that seemed out of place. Now they realized that several more sheds, slabs, and planters were oddly situated. They soon discovered the reason for that. Laura Santos, deputy coroner of Sacramento County, supervised the search.
Under every one of these odd-seeming things, like the sink, there was a body. Under the poorly poured piece of concrete, there was a body. Next to the shed that looked hastily assembled, there was a body.
After 3 days, the dig finally came to an end. 7 bodies had been uncovered in Dorothea Puente's yard. Police were dealing with a mass murderer. It seemed impossible that 7 people could have been buried right under the neighbors' noses without anyone seeing anything. Hoping for information or witnesses, detectives began interviewing Mrs. Puente's neighbors. It was hard to find anyone with anything negative to say about her.
It was like fighting an uphill battle. The community, first of all, did not want to accept the fact that this gray-haired little woman who they loved so much and who had given so much to the community was responsible for this gruesome task of putting these people in the yard.
While investigators canvassed the neighborhood, the grim task of identifying the 7 victims, 3 men and 4 women, was underway at the Sacramento coroner's office. All the bodies were x-rayed, then forensic pathologists performed autopsies on them. The coroner started with the victim most closely matching Bert Montoya's description. She began by carefully removing layers of wrapping and documenting each. The body, like many of the others, was wrapped in a signature way that suggested a methodical but twisted mind.
Sheets wrapped with duct tape, then quilts stitched together, blankets, then more sheets, more tarps. I remember there were blue tarps on a couple of the cases, and then each layer would somehow be secured either with twine or duct tape or actually stitched with thread. And then the entire bundle perhaps duct taped together.
The wrappings concealed advanced decomposition, which made it impossible to establish a cause of death for any of the victims. But because of the circumstances, all were ruled homicide. The condition of the bodies also prevented pathologists from immediately identifying any of the victims. As Dr. Santos explains,
most people are identified by fingerprints first, next by dental records, and then by other means. 4 out of the 7 bodies were too decomposed to get decent fingerprints from. None of them had any teeth, so the usual methods that we make an identification could not be used.
the tissue samples were sent to forensic labs for further analysis. To aid in identification efforts, investigators tried to locate people who had disappeared from the boarding house. They found the brother of 55-year-old Ben Fink, one of the tenants believed to be missing. But he told police he hadn't heard from Ben in 3 months. Investigators feared Ben Fink had already been found. To build their murder case against 59-year-old Dorothea Puente, police needed physical proof linking her to the victims' deaths. Investigators went through the boarding house again. They found twine, duct tape, and a coffee can with the word lie written on it. Police found dozens of bottles of the prescribed sedative Dalmane. That didn't seem unusual in a boarding house full of elderly people. But investigators noticed all of the Dalmane, although prescribed by several different doctors, was in Dorothea Puente's name. As details of the investigation became public, police began hearing from witnesses who helped them reconstruct an account of Dorothea Puente's daily routine. It seemed she had a penchant for pre-dawn gardening and became very angry if interrupted. They also learned that she insisted on personally collecting the mail every day, particularly at the end of the month.
She was always there to get the mail because, of course, the mail had the checks. And she would take the checks and keep control of all the money.
Investigators learned that nobody had questioned that control. Since most of the boarding house residents had drug or alcohol problems, it seemed a logical way to keep them from lapsing into their old habits. Police believed that by persuading residents to sign their monthly checks over to her, Mrs. Puente would be assured that the money would keep coming even after the tenants disappeared. In fact, she was getting 10 to 12 federal assistance checks each month, some for people who hadn't lived at the boarding house in years. Police believed money was the motive for murder, but they still needed to find their suspect. Despite the manhunt, Dorothea Puente was still at large. On November 16th, less than a week after she fled, investigators got a tip that Dorothea Puente was at a motel in Los Angeles. An elderly man called police when he saw her picture on TV. He'd recognized her as the woman who'd struck up a conversation about his Social Security benefits.
She wanted to know things like, how much he was getting, and was he taking, full benefit of receiving the money. And of course, he was inquisitive. But she had told him that she knew how to raise his money allotment.
Even as a fugitive, she couldn't resist the opportunity to cash in. Her greed had finally caught up with her. Dorothea Puente was finally in custody. Though they believed they knew her motive for the murders, police had no physical evidence linking her to them. In addition, the victims' identities were still unknown. A latent print examiner was brought in. He compared known samples to fingerprints from 3 of the bodies. He confirmed that one of the victims was Bert Montoya. He would soon identify Ben Fink and Dorothy Miller as well. Science had made a liar of Dorothea Puente. But there remained 4 victims without names. Police had compiled a list of 60 people who had received Social Security checks at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. They tried to track down every name on that list. They found most of the people still alive, having moved out of the house for a variety of reasons. But a few were still unaccounted for. They then assembled medical records on each missing person. The files were forwarded to the Sacramento coroner's office. There, forensic pathologists began the painstaking task of comparing x-rays of each body found in the yard to medical records from each of the missing persons. They looked for distinguishing characteristics in the records that could be linked to each victim.
We did find anomalies in the bodies, abnormalities, like one person had had skull surgery and had evidence that he'd had a craniotomy, and another person had irregular characteristics of one of her clavicles, and she'd also had some mandible lower jaw fractures in the past. And using that information from the bodies, we were then able to start making comparisons with the medical records we'd obtained from this list that Social Security had provided us.
The victims had all finally been identified. But police were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle: how they died. Until that question could be answered, authorities would have a hard time proving murder. They hoped a forensic toxicologist could give them answers. In November of 1988, police investigating the murders of 7 people at a Sacramento boarding house enlisted the aid of toxicologist William Phillips at the California Department of Justice. With no obvious cause of death, they hoped he would be able to determine whether drugs or poisons had ended the victims' lives. Phillips began by analyzing all 7 victims' tissue samples with a radioamino acid, or RIA test, which is sensitive to classes of drugs. The test results showed all of the samples contained the sedative flurazepam, which is used widely in Dalmane, the drug found at Dorothea Puente's boarding house. It is a potent sedative often prescribed for the elderly. It was the first physical evidence linking Puente to the deaths of the 7 victims. Next, Phillips subjected the samples to the tandem mass spectrometer, the only one on the West Coast at the time. The apparatus uses negative ion detection to find the characteristic profile or footprint of individual drugs. Besides detecting the presence of flurazepam, or Dalmane, in each sample, it also measured the drug's concentration. But because the bodies had been underground for varying periods of time, those concentrations did not necessarily reflect levels present at the time of death. Some of the drug could have seeped into the ground.
The drug, Dalmane, was present in all the samples, but the concentrations were so varied that no one could say whether or not the drug caused their death. But I was able to link all the samples, all the tissues, the brains, the liver tissues from all these victims to Dorothea Puente.
Investigators believed they had enough evidence to charge Dorothea Puente with the murder of her 7 tenants. Based on the evidence, police believe she would charm residents into giving her control of their money. If they were reluctant, she would invite them into her private rooms and give them a drink laced with drugs. Afterwards, she would methodically wrap the bodies and hire men to dig holes in her backyard. During her pre-dawn gardening, the 59-year-old woman managed to bury her victims. On August 15, 1993, Dorothea Puente was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. The jury was unable to reach verdicts on the other 4 charges. She was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Serial killers are methodical, skilled at covering their tracks in order to keep killing. But even the cleverest of predators cannot avoid detection for long. Today, forensic scientists using sophisticated technology are helping police stop deadly criminals with an urge to kill again. A quiet Maryland suburb is rocked by a brutal double murder. To solve this case, investigators must retrace the killer's footsteps. The dead body of a missing girl is found at an Oregon highway rest area. Strange markings on the victim's arm are investigators' best hope of identifying her killer. A Minnesota man finds his estranged wife dead in her home, the apparent victim of a sexual assault. But detectives soon learn that things aren't always what they appear to be. Some crime scenes have few clues to offer, but killers always leave some trace of themselves behind. To make their case, investigators turn to forensic examiners to isolate hidden impressions and turn them into patterns of guilt. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The affluent suburb of Annapolis, Maryland is a quiet alternative for those looking to escape the hectic pace of Washington, D.C. In this peaceful community, violent crime is almost non-existent. On Monday, May 16, 1994, all of that changed. When prominent D.C. attorneys Jean Gamble and her husband Joseph Thomas failed to show up for work, a secretary asked Ricky Cole, a handyman who did work on the couple's home, to check on them. On the front door, he found a note indicating the couple was away on vacation. But that didn't make sense. This was their vacation home. Cole let himself in with a key the couple had given him. Hello? No one appeared to be home. But in the bedroom, he made a horrifying discovery. Underneath the sheets, Jean Gamble and Joseph Thomas lay murdered in their bed. Officers and crime scene technicians from the Anne Arundel County Police Department were quickly dispatched to the scene. Investigators discovered that each victim had suffered a single gunshot wound to the back of the head from point-blank range. Blood was spattered on the wall above the bed. Anne Arundel County homicide detective Tim Zawalik was at the scene.
When we saw the crime scene and realized that it was contact wounds and the people were basically executed, it was just such a horrific crime that we knew at that point we were dealing with something that was very, very unusual.
As forensic technicians began scouring the scene for any clues to the killer's identity, investigators found Joseph Thomas's wallet and his wife's purse. Cash and a few credit cards seemed to be missing. The double murder appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. As police continued searching the house, they found no signs of a forced entry.
Let's get this mulch right down here. Okay.
But a pile of wood mulch on the floor near the unlocked kitchen door suggested the killer's probable entry point. Hoping the suspect had inadvertently left footprints behind, forensic technicians applied fingerprint powder to the floor. The tactic paid off. A sneaker print was revealed. A gelatin substance was applied to the footprint and allowed to harden, preserving it as evidence. Convinced the killer left the note to keep people away, investigators scoured it for potential clues. The manner in which the date had been written, day first, then month, led them to believe their suspect had served time in the military. Though no usable prints were recovered, tiny brown fibers were removed from the adhesive on the tape. With no witnesses to the double murder and no obvious suspects to pursue, homicide detectives knew this would be a difficult case to solve. And they feared time was working against them.
This person who committed this crime needs to be gotten off the street. If he can do a murder like this so cold and boldly, then this person's going to do it again and again and again, and it's just a scary thought.
The autopsies had a little more information to offer. The levels of rigor mortis led the medical examiner to conclude that the couple had been dead for at least 24 to 36 hours before being discovered. That placed the time of death at late Saturday evening or early Sunday morning. Examiners at the Anne Arundel County Crime Lab believed that the key to the killer's identity lay in the shoe print recovered from the scene. After identifying a New Balance logo on the shoe print, examiners searched through catalogs looking for a model with a similar tread design. They concluded that the print left at the scene had come from a New Balance running shoe, model 480BK, size 7.5. Trying to learn as much about the victims as they could, police began canvassing the neighborhood. One neighbor described Jean and Joseph as a bright, hard-working, and well-liked couple. She said that she had last seen them Saturday evening as they headed out to dinner in Jean's red Acura. She didn't recall seeing the car the following day and just assumed the couple had decided to drive together back to Washington. To investigators, it seemed more likely that the car had been stolen. An APB was issued for the vehicle. A short while later, a local bank manager who had been following the investigation in the media contacted police. One of the victim's bank cards had been used to withdraw cash from an automated teller machine. The transaction occurred only hours after the couple had been murdered. Though less than 1/3 of all ATMs were equipped with security devices in 1994, this one had a surveillance camera in place. The man was sitting in the driver's seat of Jean Gamble's red Acura.
There you go. Yeah.
Investigators believed they were looking at the face of the couple's killer. They worked feverishly to establish his identity. Flyers containing the suspect's photograph were distributed to the public. The publicity paid off. A second bank manager turned over a surveillance tape revealing the same suspect using a credit card belonging to the victims. This second transaction had taken place the day after the murders. And this time, the suspect's shoes were partially visible in the photograph. The photograph was forwarded to the Anne Arundel County Crime Lab. Examiners studied the image in an effort to determine if the shoes worn by the suspect were the same make and model as the shoe that had left the print at the crime scene. Evidence collection supervisor Jeff Cover contacted a shoe designer from New Balance.
And we actually made a trip to the factory in Lawrence, Massachusetts and met with their shoe designer there, and who could identify the outsole in the ATM photograph as a New Balance 480.
It was the same type of shoe that had left the print on the victim's kitchen floor. Believing that robbery was the motive behind the murders, investigators began scouring dozens of burglary reports, hoping to find photographs of known burglars that resembled the murder suspect.
Look at the ATM. Look at his height. This guy can't be that big.
But they found nothing. As homicide detectives continued searching through reports, a detective from the burglary division caught a glimpse of the suspect in the ATM photo.
This is the guy we're looking for, right here.
I think it's Scotland Williams.
He recognized the man.
September. For what?
It was Scotland Williams, a suspect in a string of burglaries, arrested 8 months earlier.
When we got this break, it was the break you dream about having. It was all of a sudden, we've got the guy identified. We had to move fast, and for the first time ever, we had a name to go with the face.
Having physically linked Scotland Williams to the murdered victim's ATM card and their missing vehicle, investigators obtained a warrant for his arrest.
At 6 o'clock, the lead stories on all the news channels was this murder case. Scotland Williams' picture accessing the ATM machine was shown to the public. Our surveillance team was in place, and at 6:05, the front door opened and Scotland Williams was running out the house.
Police moved in and placed him under arrest. Scotland Williams insisted he knew nothing about the murders. Looking to prove otherwise, investigators searched the residence. Inside the house, police found what they were looking for. Several pairs of sneakers, including some New Balance running shoes. They were all size 7.5. A pair of brown cotton gardening gloves was also collected and forwarded to the crime lab. Under questioning, Williams maintained his innocence. And though records indicated he had served 12 years in the military, he insisted the note found on the victim's front door was not his handwriting. Investigators confronted him with the ATM photos.
He admitted it was him at the ATM. When I showed him the picture of him, he looked at the picture and said, "Yeah, that's me." He admitted himself at the ATM, but he never made any other admissions to us. He refused to talk to us.
Investigators looked to forensic examiners to make their case. But the analysis revealed that none of the shoes recovered from Williams' house had left the print found at the crime scene. Police were convinced that Scotland Williams was responsible for the brutal murders of Jean Gamble and her husband, Joseph Thomas. But until they could come up with hard evidence linking him to the crime scene, their suspect would likely get away with murder. Police in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, believed they had arrested the man responsible for the murders of prominent Washington, D.C. attorneys Jean Gamble and her husband, Joseph Thomas. The suspect, Scotland Williams, had been captured on tape using the victim's ATM cards, wearing shoes that were consistent with a print recovered from the crime scene. But none of Williams' shoes recovered during a search of his residence produced a match. Hoping to find something that may have been overlooked, detectives went through every page of Scotland Williams' burglary reports from 8 months earlier. They found the one clue they needed to make their case. Detectives from the burglary division had photographed the soles of Williams' shoes. A Xerox copy of the shoe print was in the file. Using the reference shoe from the manufacturer as a point of comparison, evidence technician Eric Love first determined that the shoe print in the Xerox copy had been made by a New Balance model 480 BK, size 7.5. Next, he compared the unique wear patterns and nicks on the sole of the shoe print from the crime scene to those present in the Xerox copy of Scotland Williams' shoe. All of the unique characteristics matched. For evidence technician Eric Love, the evidence was overwhelming.
We knew that Scotland Williams owned a pair of model 480 from the Xerox. We also knew that Scotland Williams was wearing a shoe that was consistent with a model 480 BK the day after the murders. So by analyzing all this evidence, we were able to conclude that indeed Scotland Williams had a pair of 480 BKs, that that type of shoe was found at the crime scene, and that the Xerox of Scotland Williams' shoe was consistent with that found at the crime scene.
If any doubt about Williams' guilt remained, further analysis erased it. Examiners concluded that the brown fibers recovered from the adhesive tape on the note attached to the victim's front door were consistent with fibers from the gardening gloves found in Williams' home. Police believe Williams entered the victim's residence with the intention of burglarizing the house. But when he discovered Jean Gamble and Joseph Thomas sleeping, he pulled out his gun and shot them. He made off with cash and an ATM card, unaware that he had left behind a clue that would lead police right to him. Scotland Williams was tried and convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole, plus 70 years. Scotland Williams killed his victims as they lay in their own bed. But for some murderers, the first step is to get the victim as far away from home as possible. On June 17, 1986, a passing motorist traveling along Highway 97 in Klamath Falls, Oregon, spotted something lying beside the road. It was a sleeping bag, and it seemed to be in good condition. But when he looked inside, he found items that appeared to be blood-stained. Concerned, the motorist collected the items and took them to the Klamath Falls station of the Oregon State Police. There, detectives began searching the bag. They discovered some items of clothing, a pair of white-wing tennis shoes, a woman's purse, and duct tape attached to green paper towels. All of the items appeared to be blood-stained. Inside the purse, investigators found identification belonging to a 20-year-old woman named Carrie Love. To Detective Kenneth Cooper, the items suggested foul play.
Carrie Love. It was obvious that we had a female that was missing or possibly a homicide because of the amount of blood on the tennis shoes and in the sleeping bag itself. And the wad of paper towels had duct tape in different layers on it. And when I started opening the paper towels, I noticed clear indentation of what I thought was a nose and the chin area. And it appeared that the paper towels were put on the face.
Other items found inside the purse indicated Carrie Love worked for Northern Star Trucking Company, located more than 400 miles away in Seattle, Washington. Detectives contacted the company and learned that Carrie had recently left on a business trip from Seattle to Los Angeles with the company's owner, 42-year-old Jesse Pratt.
You heard from him recently?
They were traveling in his 18-wheeler, and their route would have put them passing through Klamath Falls.
All right.
The information, along with the blood-stained items found along the highway, led investigators to fear the worst. They decided to return to Highway 97, but now they believed they were looking for Carrie Love's body. For 3 hours, the search turned up nothing. And with the vast stretch of highway and the dozens of rest areas, Carrie Love could be anywhere. But then, Detective Cooper remembered one isolated spot in particular, the Chelmut rest area.
There's no facilities there. It's totally unlit. It's behind a full wall of trees. It's totally secluded, And at night, it's absolutely pitch black. And that would be an ideal place to pull a body and cover them up with the gravel.
When the detective arrived at the location, he realized his instincts had been dead on. Partially buried underneath a pile of gravel lay the lifeless body of a young woman. For investigators, there was no doubt that Carrie Love had been found. Blood-stained items found along a highway in Klamath Falls, Oregon, led police to the body of 20-year-old Carrie Love, an employee of a Seattle trucking company who disappeared while traveling to Los Angeles on business with her boss. And the evidence suggested her death had been a brutal one. She had been stabbed repeatedly. Her crushed head and torso indicated she had been run over by a large vehicle. Strange bruises on her arm appeared to be tire tracks. Detectives meticulously documented and collected every scrap of evidence. Seeing the young woman so brutalized only intensified Detective Kenneth Cooper's resolve to see that her killer was brought to justice.
When you run into something that bad, it's hard not to get personal. It's important that you do everything correct. Because at this point, you know beyond any doubt, if you don't do it perfect, you could lose it in court. And you can't afford to do that. Because at that point, we become this person's mouthpiece. We're the ones that's going to scream justice for her because she's unable to at this point.
At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Carrie had been asphyxiated, then stabbed 12 times before being run over. The stab wounds were consistent with those caused by an ice pick or a knitting needle. She had also been raped, though no usable biological evidence was recovered. Other than the tread impressions, the only clues to the killer's identity were some red cotton fibers found in the victim's hands.
The day I dropped her off.
As word of Carrie's murder spread through her hometown of Seattle, her boyfriend came in to speak with police there. He believed that Carrie's boss, 42-year-old Jesse Pratt, had something to do with the murder. He said Pratt had a strange fixation with Carrie. In fact, a month earlier, he and Carrie attended a high school prom together. As they were leaving, the boyfriend spotted Jesse Pratt sitting in his car across the street. He was just watching them. The boyfriend confirmed that the last time he saw Carrie was when she and Pratt left the Northern Star Trucking Company heading to Los Angeles. That was 2 days before Carrie's body was discovered in Oregon. Seattle police began trying to locate Jesse Pratt, the last person seen with Carrie Love. The receptionist at Northern Star Trucking had not heard from her boss since he left for Los Angeles a few days earlier. As the questioning continued, a call came in.
This is Mona. Hey, Jesse.
It was Jesse Pratt.
The detective's here and he's asking if Carrie's missing. Sure, just 1 second.
Jesse?
Seeming eager to cooperate, he told police he and Carrie had left Seattle together on June 16th.
Now.
But an hour or so after leaving, she decided she wanted to fly to Los Angeles instead.
All right. When are you coming back to?
He believed she became uncomfortable being with him after the two had consensual sex. Pratt said he drove her to the Seattle airport and continued on to Los Angeles. He said he was currently in Phoenix, Arizona, making a delivery but he would be back in Seattle the following day. But police didn't want to wait. An APB was issued for his rig. A few hours later, Arizona authorities spotted the 18-wheeler just outside of Phoenix. When Jesse Pratt could not provide a valid trucker's license, police took him into custody. His truck was impounded for a thorough examination. Oregon State Police detectives flew to Arizona to question Pratt themselves. By the time they arrived, however, Pratt had hired an attorney, and he advised his client not to answer any questions. Insisting he had nothing to hide, Pratt consented to giving police his red T-shirt for a closer examination. As he removed his shirt, they observed and photographed several suspicious scratches around his ribs. Convinced the injuries had been caused during a struggle, police searched Pratt's truck for signs of violence. Inside the cab, they recovered a briefcase, some duct tape, and a roll of unopened green paper towels, similar to the ones found with the victim's belongings along Highway 97. Forensic technicians also examined the tires of Pratt's rig. Though the treads didn't appear to resemble the bruising found on the victim's arm, the tires were removed and stored as possible evidence. For Detective Sergeant Richard Stroop of the Oregon State Police, the search of Pratt's truck had failed to produce evidence of murder.
Interestingly, the truck itself did not provide us with any significant evidence, and I think that in and of itself was significant, at least to me, because it was very obvious this thing had been cleaned. It was spotless. There was no forensic evidence found in the vehicle, and you would have expected to see something there. So obviously, it was obvious to us that Jesse Pratt had cleaned that truck out pretty thoroughly.
Investigators scrutinized the contents of Pratt's briefcase. They found a potential clue, a gas receipt from a truck stop located 100 miles south of the Seattle airport. The receipt was dated the evening of June 16th, 2 days before Carrie Love's body was found. Perhaps someone there remembered seeing Pratt. The attendant who worked that evening was shown a photo lineup and asked if anyone looked familiar.
Anybody you recognize?
Without hesitation, he pointed to Jesse Pratt.
Yes, sir.
The attendant remembered him well.
Are you positive? Without a doubt.
What stuck out in his mind was the mismatch between Pratt's unkempt appearance and that of the attractive young woman traveling with him. They had stopped to fill up. The young woman asked about using the restroom, but the driver seemed to be in a hurry, yelling at her to hurry up. The attendant remembered feeling that the two seemed like an odd pair. When asked if he could identify the woman traveling with Pratt, he picked out Carrie Love. Investigators knew that Pratt could not have dropped Carrie off at the Seattle airport as he previously claimed. Jesse Pratt had been caught in a lie. At the crime lab, examiners compared fibers from Pratt's red T-shirt with those recovered from Carrie Love at autopsy. The shape, color, and texture of the fibers were all consistent. Though the case was largely circumstantial, a jury found Jesse Pratt guilty of first-degree murder. But this case was far from over. In January 1990, Pratt's conviction was overturned on appeal, and a new trial was ordered. Oregon State Police wasted no time preparing for the next trial.
Now that's the actual tire that we think ran over it, right?
They were determined to present the new jury with a bulletproof case.
Inside of the truck, we could
And the best way to do that was to prove that the strange bruises found on the victim's arm had come from the tires of Pratt's 18-wheeler. Photographs of Carrie Love's injuries and inked impressions of Pratt's tires were forwarded to renowned tire tread expert Pete McDonald in Hudson, Ohio. First, he confirmed the contusions on the victim's arm had been made by a tire, but not from the outer tread. The marks, which appeared as bars on the victim's arm, had come from design patterns located on the side of the tire. And all of the bars were the same size and shape except one. For McDonald, that was a telltale sign that the tire he was looking for had been retreaded. The contusions on the victim's arm captured the exact spot where the old tread had been spliced with the new one. Looking for a match, he traveled to the Oregon Crime Lab to view the evidence himself. After viewing the side design patterns of all 18 wheels, McDonald believed the right rearmost tire, which had been retreaded, looked the most consistent with the injuries found on Carrie Love's arm. Using carbon paper, he traced the tire, creating an exact reproduction for later comparisons. McDonald measured the unique bar patterns from the tire and compared it with photographs taken to scale of the injuries. All of the dimensions matched. Next, McDonald created a model that would help the new jury understand how an 18-wheel truck could run over a person with only one tire.
I made a little model of the victim's body to scale with this tractor trailer. And then I moved the tractor trailer, and as you can see, this right rear tire, and only the right rear tire, is making the imprint. And now the inside of that tire is coming across the inside of the victim's arm.
Still, McDonald knew from experience that his analysis was not foolproof. He contacted the manufacturer of the retreaded tire for specific information.
Whenever I end up going into court, I find that the defense attorney is going to logically say, well, you identified this tire imprint, but there are millions of these tires out there. I called this manager, and he informed me that there were very few tires, like 300 of this brand, and only about 100 of this actual size.
The manager discovered he still had the bill of sale for the retreaded tire that had run over Carrie Love. Northern Star Trucking had purchased it. Ironically, the check for the tire had been signed by Carrie Love herself, just a few weeks before she was murdered. Police believe that as Pratt and Carrie passed through Klamath Falls, Oregon on the way to Los Angeles, he pulled off the road at a rest area and made sexual advances toward Carrie. When Carrie resisted, Pratt raped and killed her, then buried her underneath the gravel and drove his truck over her body. The jury found Jesse Pratt guilty of aggravated murder. On April 16, 1991, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. All of his subsequent appeals have been denied. Jesse Pratt believed that burying his victim would conceal his crime. But others will manipulate the crime scene itself, hoping to send investigators in the wrong direction. St. Paul, Minnesota, March 20th, 1996. An early morning 911 call brought police from the St. Paul Police Department to the home of 31-year-old Stacy Brown. Stacy's estranged husband had stopped by the house and discovered his wife dead on the couch. She had been brutally beaten and strangled to death. The position of her body on the couch and the fact that she was nude from the waist down suggested she had also been sexually assaulted. While examining the body, homicide detective Keith Mortensen found a strange clue. There were odd-shaped contusions and bruising on the inside of the victim's leg.
I thought that it was an odd location for a bruise, for someone to normally get a bruise. Typically, I think if you get a bruise, it's on the shin area or on the front of your leg, sometimes on the side from bumping into something, but more unusual to get it on the inside of the leg.
Though Stacy appeared to be the victim of a sex crime, a closer examination of the scene led investigators to have some doubts.
One of her legs was up on the arm of the couch, yet there was a coffee table there with a number of items on it which were undisturbed. Her underwear were on the floor at the base or kind of by her right foot, and again it didn't appear to be in the position that it would be if someone were attacking her sexually.
Investigators now had to consider that this crime scene had been staged in an effort to conceal the real motive behind the murder. They hoped an autopsy could tell them more. Police in St. Paul, Minnesota had no doubts that 31-year-old Stacy Brown had been brutally murdered in her home. But a closer examination suggested her killer had staged the crime scene in an effort to make her death appear to be the result of a violent sexual assault. At autopsy, the medical examiner concluded that Stacy had died as a result of asphyxiation. She had been strangled with a telephone cord and a wire hanger. And despite the fact that Stacy had been found nude from the waist down, he found no physical evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. He was also unable to explain the source of strange bruising found on Stacy's leg. Convinced the crime scene had been staged to throw investigators off the killer's trail, police believed the suspect would be someone close to the victim. 34-year-old Lewis Brown, Stacy's estranged husband, and the man who discovered her body, was brought in for questioning. He was devastated that Stacy was gone. Brown, who wears leg braces as a result of childhood polio, stated that he dropped by the house early that morning to drop off presents he bought for his youngest daughter. When he noticed the keys dangling in the front door, he made his way inside. That's when he discovered his wife dead on the couch.
Well, I just dropped my kids off.
Brown realized that his impending divorce made him a logical suspect. But he insisted he still loved Stacy, his wife of 8 years, and the mother of his 3 children. On the night that she was murdered, Brown said he was at a local bar playing pool until going home around 1 a.m. He could think of only one person who would want to hurt his wife, a man involved with Stacy's best friend, Rebecca. Rebecca was contacted, and she agreed to an interview. She admitted that her boyfriend, Quan Tran, and Stacy had not gotten along. Stacy felt Tran was abusive and had urged Rebecca to end the relationship. But Tran became enraged by Stacy's meddling. A few days before the murder, he had smashed out the windows of Stacy's car. And later that same evening, there was another incident. A piece of a brick suddenly came crashing through the window of Stacy's house as she and Rebecca ate dinner. Attached was a frightening message written in broken English apparently from Tran. The message threatened Stacy's life and warned her to stay out of Tran and Rebecca's business. Stacy had reported the incident and gave police the brick and the letter. Despite Tran's temper, Rebecca didn't believe he was capable of murder. Police felt otherwise.
Quan Tran was considered a suspect in the breaking of the porch window, as he had just been there and broken out some windows on a car. It also left him as a suspect in the murder case as well, because of the involvement. If we could link the other two incidents together, then maybe we can link him to the murder as well.
I did throw the brick.
Tran was picked up and brought to the police station.
I didn't do it,
Under questioning, he admitted smashing the victim's car out of anger, but he adamantly denied throwing a brick through her porch window.
I didn't do it. Yes.
He also denied any knowledge of Stacy's murder.
You did throw the brick. Yeah, I don't.
But investigators noticed scratches on his hands. And on the sleeve of his jacket, there were stains that appeared to be blood.
That was from my hand when I wiped it. Was it your blood?
He claimed he had injured himself at work. Police took the jacket and forwarded it to the crime lab.
Okay. You should take this pad.
He was also asked to provide a handwriting sample.
And I'm gonna tell you something to write. Don't disguise it. Just write it.
Mr. Tran didn't know exactly why we suspected him, other than that we explained to him that he had been to the victim's home and he had broken out windows there, and that the next incident that happened was another broken-in window, and then the next incident that happened was a murder.
Though the evidence was pointing to Tran as the suspect, he believed he was being framed for Stacy's murder. Crime lab analysis of the evidence seemed to support his claims of innocence. Handwriting analysis revealed that Tran had not written the threatening letter to Stacy. And DNA testing of the bloodstains found on his jacket proved that the blood had not come from the victim. The investigation had hit a dead end. Police were back where they had started, with a dead body and no solid suspects. Police in St. Paul, Minnesota struggled to identify a suspect in the murder of Stacy Brown, a 31-year-old mother of 3. Feeling something may have been overlooked, police began re-examining all their evidence, including statements made by the victim's estranged husband, 34-year-old Lewis Brown. Brown had claimed that on the night of the murder, he went to a local bar and played pool until 1 a.m. To corroborate the alibi, police decided to go to the bar. There, employees who had worked the night of Stacy's murder were shown photographs of Lewis Brown.
I'm looking for an individual, this individual here.
No one recognized the man, and they felt certain they would have remembered him.
They stated that they had very few Asian customers and that they would have definitely noticed someone with a marked limp who was wearing braces on their legs.
Though the information hardly proved that Brown was a killer, it suggested he had lied to police about his whereabouts the night of the murder. To learn more, police visited the facility where Brown was employed as an alarm technician for the St. Paul school system. Investigators asked his supervisor to look around Brown's workstation. There, the detective noticed and collected pens and a yellow writing pad, which looked consistent with the note attached to the brick that had been thrown through the victim's window. As the detective made his way out of the building, he spotted a broken piece of a brick being used as a paperweight to hold down some newspapers. He took it on the remote chance it was from the same brick thrown through Stacy's window. When the edges of the two broken pieces were lined up, Detective Mortensen was astonished to find a perfect fit. Louis Brown, not Quan Tran, had thrown the brick with a note written in broken English through his wife's window. Though Brown's efforts to frame Tran had backfired, police still lacked hard evidence linking him to the murder scene. They obtained a warrant to search his house. Brown's roommate led police to the suspect's bedroom. There, investigators found a few articles of clothing that appeared to be bloodstained. As the search continued, detectives noticed several leg braces scattered around the room. All of the items were collected.
We need to take this leg brace off.
Detective Mortensen forwarded the evidence to the Ramsey County Medical Examiner for analysis. There, Dr. Michael McGee worked the case. After reviewing the autopsy photos, he believed that identifying the source of the bruises on Stacy's leg would be the key to exposing her killer's identity.
It had a peculiar appearance to it. It was a broken line separated by gaps or spaces that were fairly even. And if you looked at it, you could tell it was caused by some type of object that was machined and had certain dimensions to it.
Dr. McGee, this just came in from St. Paul.
Then, Dr. McGee learned from police that the prime suspect, Louis Brown, wore leg braces. He began analyzing all of the braces collected from the suspect's bedroom. One in particular caught his attention. It contained a knee support with an L-shaped hinge. Dr. McGee superimposed the hinge of the leg brace directly on top of a photograph of the wound.
The brace in the open position matches exactly with the abrasion and injury that's present. The opened edges of the hinge are responsible for the area of abraded tissue present on the subject's leg. The spaces in the part of the mechanism here are responsible for the clear spaces present on the injury. The bruise that extends in an upward L fashion is due to the smooth aluminum strut.
The only way the leg brace could have caused the injury to Stacy's leg was if the person wearing it had been directly on top of her. Louis Brown was the only person known to have worn those braces. He was arrested and charged with the murder of his estranged wife.
I used to live here.
Police theorized that on the evening of March 19th, an argument between Louis and Stacy turned violent. After strangling his wife, he staged the scene to look like a sexual assault in an effort to throw investigators off his trail. But all the while, his leg brace had pressed down on her leg. On January 31st, 1998, a jury found Louis Brown guilty of murder. A few days later, he was sentenced to life in prison. When leaving the scene of a murder, most killers believe they have successfully covered their tracks. But no matter how hard they try, clues to their identity always remain. Forensic examiners can uncover hidden prints and impressions and expose patterns of guilt.